Today we are doing a complete guide on the Fujifilm X-T50. This video will be split up into 3 parts, which is a button walkthrough, a settings walkthrough, and then finally how to use this camera after you know the buttons and you've set up your settings. Starting off on the bottom of this camera, we have a little door here where we can insert the battery, which as you can see, there are some pins here, and then there is a color tab here. So you want to make sure the pins are down and you insert the color tab at the correct location to match this orange lever. And there's also an SD card slot here, which you can put any SD card you want in. And once you do that, the camera is good to go in terms of power and storage. Starting with the back of the camera, we have the flip screen. This only flips out in one direction, so you can either look at it from waist level, or you could flip it down if you want to get shots from the bottom of the camera. Other than that, this is not a vlog screen and it can't flip out in any other directions. In the top left of this camera, you have this trash can icon, which if you're in the playback menu can be used to delete photos, but if you're in the shoot menu, then this will be used as a drive function, and the drive function is just used to select between single frame shoot in, high burst shoot in, or a ton of different other modes. To the right of that button is a playback menu. This is how you're gonna review your images. In the middle of this camera, we have the electronic viewfinder. Right here is the sensor, so when you press your eye up to this, then the screen will change from the back screen into the electronic LCD. And then you have a diopter here, which is used to adjust your eye's focus. So if you wear glasses and you can't see the screen clearly, you'll adjust this until the screen is in focus. On the right side of the viewfinder, you have the autofocus on button. If you don't want to focus with the shutter button, you can focus with this autofocus on button. And then to the right of that button, you have the first command dial here, which you can use to scroll through settings. Making our way down the camera, we have the auto exposure lock. If you get an exposure that you like and you don't want your auto exposure to change, you'll just hold this button down and it will lock that exposure into place, and then you can move around into a different location without worrying about your exposure changing. Below that, we have the joystick, which is used to navigate through the menus, select focus point, and a ton of other functions. Below the joystick, we have the menu and OK button, which can be used to open up the menu and go through settings. And then below the menu button, we have the display and back button, which can be used to go back in the settings menu or shift through displays. And then the last button on the back of the camera is the Q button. This is to get into the quick menu, which is used to easily access some of your favorite settings. On the left side of this camera, we have access to all the ports that they present us with, which is a microphone jack, a USB-C cable, and an HDMI cable. On the top left of this camera, we have this little lever here, which opens the pop-up flash. If you want to close it, you're just going to push it down manually. And then right next to that lever is also the first ever film simulation dial. This chooses between some custom film settings or some presets that are already made in the camera, like Velvia or Classic Chrome. Or if you want to just go into the menu to select your own, you'll just set this to C and then you'll pick it by yourself. On the top of the camera here is the hot shoe mount. This can be used to attach a numerous amount of accessories such as microphones and flashes. It does have connector pins here, so if you are using a compatible flash, it will communicate with the camera. On the right side of the viewfinder here, we have the shutter speed wheel. This can be used to select your shutter speed, and similarly to the film dial, if you set this to the T mode, then you can use one of these command dials here on the back to select the shutter speed setting. To the right of the shutter speed wheel, we have the exposure compensation wheel. This can be used to set your exposure compensation, or you can set it to C and then set it using one of these command dials. If you ever get confused with your shutter speed, your aperture, or your ISO, then you can flip this camera into auto mode using the lever attached to the shutter speed dial. This is going to turn your camera into auto mode and basically just make it a point and shoot. But if you want to get manual settings, you'll just flick this off and then you'll have your camera in manual mode again. At the top of the camera, we have our on-off lever, which is also attached to the shutter button here, which you can half press to focus or fully press to take a photo. And then the last button on the top is a custom button right to the right of the shutter button. The next thing that we have is the dedicated kit lens for the Fujifilm X-T50 system, which is the 16 to 50 millimeter. If you want to expose the front element, you're just going to pinch this lens protector and take it off. And then if you want to use the dedicated lens hood, you can just twist this to come off and then twist it back on to attach it into place. There is one switch on this lens, which allows you to control the aperture by using this ring right here, or you can set it to auto, and then you can control the aperture using the X-T50 camera. One thing that you can't control with the camera is the zoom range. You have to use this to control your zoom range. If we look at the front of the X-T50, we have this LED illumination, which helps with autofocus in low light. We have our second command dial here, which can be used to change some settings once we set that up. And then we have this lever here, which selects our focus mode from single, continuous, or manual focus. And then finally, we want to attach the lens to the camera, which we can do so by pressing this button and twisting off the body cap. This is going to expose your sensor, which typically you don't want to do for too long. So if you are going to attach your lens to your camera, you're gonna want to do this quickly. To attach the lens, you're also just gonna twist this off. There's no button or lever to press on the lens. And then you're just gonna line up the orange lines on these camera and lens, and you're gonna twist it into place. If you do find in this process that you get dust on the back elements of your lens or on your sensor, then one thing that you're gonna want to invest in is a rocket blower. This is going to blow off the dust without having to touch your sensor. You never want to touch your sensor or your back elements, but if you do get dust onto either of these items, you're just gonna wanna hold them towards the ground and blow up gently into the sensor or the back elements of the lens, and the dust will fall out of the lens or the sensor and onto the ground, and then you can attach these without any dust on them. So that's a full walkthrough of all the buttons on the Fujifilm X-T50. We're gonna go through the most important settings inside of the camera and just changing those. Before we continue, I want to tell you about the sponsor of this video, which is Skillshare. When I got my first camera, I spent time learning in classes such as Photography Essentials, Understanding the Basics, and Adobe Lightroom, Finding Your Unique Editing Style. These classes can teach you about the exposure triangle to help you experiment with your camera, and also teach you to get a consistent look on all of your edited images. I chose to learn on Skillshare because Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives, with thousands of classes led by industry experts across photography, video, and more. Skillshare enabled me to take my passions and side hustle to the next level. Skillshare now has learning paths which contain curated classes to help you achieve a certain goal. This summer, I'm planning on watching the Supercharge Your Productivity with Notion Learning Path to help me be more organized in my creative and business work. The first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Now back to the camera. When you first turn on this camera, the first menu that you get is the language. You're just gonna select your language of choice. You're gonna select your time, and then you're gonna select your correct date format. This is gonna give you some information about transferring images to your smartphone, which personally I don't care too much about. Then you could select your auto power off temp, which I'm gonna set to high, and it's gonna give you a little warning about this, but that's okay, and you could select okay. Now there's gonna be a ton of distractions and stuff on the screen of this camera, but that's okay. We're just gonna hop straight into the menu, and we're gonna go through these settings really quick. Once we're inside the menu, on the left side, we could see that the settings are grouped by category. We can see image quality, autofocus, manual focus, shoot-in, flash, movie, setup, network, and then there's a My menu that's grayed out. You can customize this My menu later, and you could choose between all of your favorite settings that you learn here and then select them and put them down there so they're easily accessible. When you first get this camera, it's gonna be set up to only shoot JPEGs. I think that this is good because that means you can easily post your photos online anywhere, but you're paying to get a very premium camera, and you're gonna want to utilize what it can capture fully, so that is a RAW file. A RAW file you can't post immediately, but it's really, really good for editing. So what we're gonna wanna do is go into image quality here, and we're gonna wanna select Fine plus RAW. This is gonna give you 2 files, one that you could post right away using your Fujifilm simulation or however you get it straight out of the camera, and a RAW photo, which is not gonna have all the processes of that film simulation, but you can edit that later. You can add Lightroom presets, anything else to that, and it's gonna look really, really good. It's gonna look better than the JPEG, but you gotta give it some time. So we're gonna go here and select Fine plus RAW. One of the main selling points of this camera is that film simulation dial, and in here you can see there is a film simulation dial setting, which is going to allow you to choose your favorite simulations. So in here you can choose FS1, FS2, FS3, and your Acros profile. You might be wondering about the Acros profile, but you can select different filters on here like yellow, red, or green, so that's why that is an option. And then in here you could select which one of these film simulations you want to be your favorite. So if you have some in here that are not available on the dial, you can come in here and make sure that you have those finally available to you. Next up, we have film simulation, and up here we could select it using the dial, or we can select it inside of this menu. But if you want to get a little deeper into film simulations and creating recipes, that's when you start diving into stuff like grain effect, color chrome effect blue, the white balance, dynamic range, tone curve, color, clarity, and a bunch of these other settings. These are called custom settings, or more known as recipes. And with these, I have a whole dedicated video. It's about 20 minutes long. It's gonna tell you how to set it up, and I highly recommend watching that if you wanna set up those profiles. But for now, let's continue walking through the camera, because the film recipes are something that you change often, whereas what we're going through right now is something that we're gonna set once and forget it. So let's continue with those settings. So next up, we're hopping into the autofocus and manual focus settings, and I'm gonna tell you what's most important here. The focus area is just where the single point would be if you are going to use that. The autofocus mode is going to be which mode you're shooting in. There's all, wide, zone, and single point. I really like single point. I like using the joystick to move around the single point. But if you're new and you're used to an iPhone, then maybe you could get away with all, wide, or zone. I'm just going to leave this on all right now because it's something that I think a lot of people will like to use. The next important setting in this menu is the AFC custom settings. When you're in AFC, which is the continuous autofocus, we need to choose how fast and snappy this autofocus is going to be. So they have some presets set for us, which has the tracking sensitivity and the speed of the tracking sensitivity. So if you go through these, you can see what they're set for. One is multi-purpose, one is to ignore obstacles and continue tracking subject. 3 is for accelerating or decelerating subjects. And really, you can choose whatever you want in here. I think the multi-purpose one is perfectly fine, but if you think the autofocus is not that good and you don't really like the algorithm that it has, then come in here and choose a different algorithm, or even set up your own algorithm to get it as snappy as you like it. In page 2 of the autofocus manual focus, we have some important things here. We have the face and eye detection settings. We could go in here and we could turn it on and off, which is important depending on if you're shooting portraits or not. If you're not shooting portraits, then you can leave this off, but if you are, you're gonna wanna come in here and turn it on. Same thing with the subject detection. You can come in here and find some of their new algorithms, such as animal, bird, automobile, motorcycle, airplane, and train. If you're not using any of those, then just leave this off. In page 3 of the autofocus manual focus, we have the release and focus priority. This is dependent on if we're in autofocus single or autofocus continuous. If we're in autofocus single, the priority is to focus the camera, which means when you're taking a picture, this is going to sometimes feel like the shutter is lagging because it's trying to focus before it takes the picture. So you might not be able to take the photo right at the split second you want. It's gonna wait till it's in focus. When you're in autofocus continuous, it automatically has it set up for release, which means even if the picture isn't in focus, the shutter is gonna feel very snappy and it's gonna start taking pictures before the camera ever gets in focus. You can change these if you want to have autofocus continuous have that focus, so it's gonna have that lag, or you could have the autofocus single be focused on release, so it might not be in focus. I think they're set up pretty well because, you know, if you're shooting continuous, eventually you're gonna get a shot that's in focus. And if you're only shooting one shot, you wanna make sure it's in focus. So I think these are set up pretty appropriately, and that's how I would leave them. For touchscreen mode, I really do not like how this is set to shoot. I would like to have this to just have autofocus because that's what is similar to a phone. Usually you'll tap your screen to focus, and I think that's good. For me, I would actually turn this off because, you know, I focus with either the shutter or the AF on button. But if you're new and you're used to smartphone shooting, then having AF here I think is really good. Now we're into the shoot-in, and the first setting here that's important is self-timer. If we go in here, we can select if we want a 2, 10, or no second timer. This is good if we want to set our camera up on a tripod and get a picture of ourselves or someone else. In page 2 of shoot-in, we have the shutter type, which is very important. We have mechanical shutter, electronic shutter, and then a bunch of different types of electronic and manual shutter combinations. I think the two most important here are the mechanical and the electronic. Electronic shutter can let you get crazy fast shutter speeds, but you're gonna get some warping effects if you're moving the camera around when you're shooting. Whereas mechanical shutter is gonna have less capped shutter speeds, but it's gonna be a lot more consistent and you shouldn't get that much jello or warping effect. So I usually leave this at mechanical because 1/4000th of a second, which is the fastest on mechanical, is perfectly fine for me. Similar to the self timer, we have the interval timer. What we do here is we're gonna use with in-camera timer, and then we can select basically how often we want this interval to shoot. So we could set it to 3 seconds, and then we could set a number of pictures it will take, which we could set to infinity. And what this is gonna do is every 3 seconds, it's gonna take a picture. So instead of setting the self timer once for 3 seconds, run in, getting your photo, and then coming back to check the photo, you can just go set this interval timer and then take photos for 2 minutes, hopping into different poses, come to your camera, and then you could view all of those photos at once. And it's a lot better than doing self-timer and going back and forward, getting sweaty. You just wanna set up this interval timer. I highly recommend this over self-timer, but it's a little more difficult to learn, so I understand if you just wanna set up self-timer because it's easy to you. Next up, we have the ISO settings of this camera, and in here we could select what ISO we wanna shoot at. The most important things in here are your auto ISOs. So we could hop into the auto 1 ISO here and we could learn how to set this up. Basically, the default sensitivity should always be set to the lowest ISO possible, which is 125. So we're gonna set that. The minimum shutter speed is the shutter speed that the camera is going to get to automatically before it starts turning your ISO up. So for minimum shutter speed, I recommend keeping it at 1/100 if you have like shaky hands. But if you're always gonna be shooting very steady, then since this camera has IBIS, you could probably get away with 1/60th, 1/40th, 1/30th. But if you're not gonna be thinking too much about it and you're gonna be running gunning with your camera, 1/100 is pretty good. So once that camera hits 1/100 and it wants to go lower to add in more light, it's gonna start raising your ISO. And this is gonna decide the max sensitivity right here. This is how high it will raise your ISO. So basically you can set this at what you feel comfortable with your camera. I would say 3200 is probably good, maybe 6400. So you could set that at 3200. So then you might be asking, what if your camera hits 1/100 and then hits 3200 max sensitivity? Well, once it hits that point, then it's gonna start to lower the shutter speed even below the minimum. It's gonna change the shutter speed before the sensitivity. So after it hits the 3200, then it's gonna start lowering the shutter speed to 1/60th, 1/50th. So just keep that in mind, that your max sensitivity, if it's not high enough to get the amount that you need, then your shutter speed's gonna go even lower than this. But first it's gonna change your shutter speed, then it's gonna change your ISO, then it's gonna change your shutter speed again. So just keep that in mind. This is a high resolution camera, which means it could have a digital teleconverter without losing too much quality. So you could come in here and either have a 1.4 times digital teleconverter or a 2 times digital teleconverter. Personally, I'm not gonna use this, I'll just crop and post, so I'm gonna leave this off. Next up, we have the flash page, and the only thing you really need to know here is how to turn your flash on. We're gonna go into the flash function setting, and then we're gonna go here with the sync terminal, and we're just gonna flick this on using this button. This is gonna set the camera into manual mode. If you flick this out, you could see it's going to be in TTL mode. Then you could also switch it back into manual mode. And then you have other options which you could choose in this camera. So one thing to know is to just flick this out to be in TTL mode. If you close it, it can be in manual or off. And now we are in one of the most important pages, which is the setup page. The first setup that we have is the user setting, and in here we have some important things that we need to know about. First off, format is to erase everything on the SD card, your internal storage that you put inside of the camera. If you do this, this will delete all of your photos and videos, so you only do this after you move your photos and videos off the camera. Next up are some of those initial settings that we set at the beginning, the area, date, time, and language. We can skip over those. Before on the bottom, there was a grayed out My Menu setting on the bottom over here, and now we can finally set those up using the My Menu setting for photo or video. Specifically, we'll talk about the photo one just because that's what we're doing. We can hop into here and we can add items, and from any of these blue items, we can select these and add them to My Menu. I recommend put in the settings that you think you're gonna use the most here. If you are interested in just copying what I use, in my Fujifilm X-106 video, I go over what I put into my Menu, and then that can be copied. But if you want to set up your own, this is a completely subjective menu, so do as you feel pleased. If you need to reset your camera because you messed up some settings and you're not sure what's wrong with it, you can just come in here and reset by initializing the camera, and then you could watch this video from the start and set it up again. The sound setup has a lot of the sound off. If you want the camera to make some noise when you're doing some of the functions, you can come in here and turn them on. For screen setup, I find that most of these settings are pretty good. I just came in here and turned my LCD brightness up. This is good for recording videos of the camera or shooting out in bright daylight. And this is the number one thing. I would say LCD brightness is something you want to change, although this will impact battery life a lot. In page 3 of the screen settings, we have display custom settings. And if we hop into here, there are 5 pages of things that will show on the shoot-in menu of this camera, and you can just go through and select which ones you want to have on. A ton of these are going to be selected at first, but I recommend, just turning them on and off, seeing what's on your screen, seeing what you like, what you don't like. For example, I really like histogram. That's something that's very important to me. I really like the exposure compensation. I'm not sure if I like digit or scale more. Sometimes I like the digit, sometimes I like the scale. So today I'll turn the scale on. I'll turn if I can see if my flash is on or off, because that's always good to know. White balance is always good to see on the screen. Frames remaining is always good to see. There's a ton of stuff in here that's good to see and not good to see, just depending on what you like. I'd like to know if something's wrong with my SD card, so I'd like to see the no storage media warning. I'd like to see the battery level. And there's just a ton of other stuff you could go through in here. You could turn them all on, you could turn them all off if you want it to be simple. But this is something important to look through. Just set it up. This is all personal preference again. But there's a ton of stuff in here that can, really help your shooting experience or take away from it. So go through here, take your time with this, click through one by one, and it'll be a good experience for you. Now we're into the button and dials, and the focus lever is actually this joystick. And as you can see, if we push into here, we can see the push is going to center your focus point and the tilt is going to edit your focus point. That's just good to know for the future. I wouldn't change what these functionalities do, but it's good to know what the focus lever does. The quick menu is this Q button on the side here, and when you press it, it's going to display a bunch of custom settings that you set. This is kind of similar to your My menu, except you could view this using the quick menu. So you can go in here and you can see that they have 16 slots already set up. Just for example, I'm going to go into the 4 slots here so you could get a quick example. You can go into here and select whatever one of these 6 menu items that you want. For example, if I want grain effect, then I could go in here and I could change grain whenever I want. I could go in here and set movie mode frame rate, and then I easily have access to grain, movie mode frame rate. I don't know why you would set these up that way, but you can if you want to. If you're interested in having my exact Q menu, then I have that in the X106 video. It takes a little bit to go over. But if you want to set it up for yourself, then just go in here, select as many slots as you want, and then go through all of these 6 pages and find what's most important to you. Set it up really neat, because if you have a good quick menu, it's going to make your experience of the camera a lot better. But if you have a bad quick menu and you always have to go into these dedicated sides to find the setting that you want, it's just going to be a hassle to play around with the camera and you're not going to be too creative. So I highly recommend, setting up that My menu, setting up this Q menu, because then you're focusing less on changing the settings of this camera when you're out shooting, and you're focusing more on being creative. Next up, we have the function FN settings, and this is the custom buttons inside of the camera. As you can see, we have that custom 1 button that we went over on the top, and it's initially set to the face detection on or off. And then you can see we have FN2, which is the film simulations. And then we have some of these touch functionalities, which allows you to do some quick selections. Me personally, I hate touch functionality, so I'm gonna go ahead and turn all of these off. Then you have some of these other buttons that are named, but you could still change what they do. So the auto exposure lock is set to auto exposure lock at first, but you could change it to whatever you want. You could change it to just change your performance. But if you do, it's gonna be kind of hard to remember what you set these buttons up for. So it's up to you if you wanna change these buttons or leave them what they're set at first. As you can see, you have the autofocus on, and then you have the rear dial, and you have the Q menu. Like if you change the Q menu, that's just crazy to me, because the quick menu is so helpful. But you can if you want to. You could change that to be the playback button if you don't like the playback button over here. So you could do what you want. This is completely subjective. Once again, if you're interested in how I set up my custom buttons, I have that in the X106 video, because the X106 is my main camera. So I have that set up like perfectly to me. This camera is just a loaner, so I have it set up just so you guys can see what you can do with this camera. Next up is the command dial settings, and if you go inside of the command dial settings, you can set what this front command dial, what the back command dial, are doing. So the back command dial right now is set to do shutter speed, and then the front command dial is set to do aperture, or if you click it, then it does exposure compensation, or if you click it again, then it does ISO, or if you click it again, it does film. I don't know why you would want your front command dial to do 4 things, so I'm gonna go ahead and set a bunch of these to none. For me, I would most likely set this to be aperture and then ISO on the front command dial, and then shutter speed on the back command dial. That makes the most sense for me. Then you have your exposure triangle on 2 command dials. It would be nice to have, 3 command dials to be able to choose from, but it's perfectly fine. Using a combination of the retro dials and the command dials, you can have it set so you have your exposure triangle easily accessible. On page 2 of the button and dial settings, we have the shutter autofocus. This here, if we're in autofocus single or autofocus continuous, we could choose if the half press is going to focus with the shutter. You can go in here and turn these on or off if you want to use the AF on button. If you don't care too much, you probably just want to leave these on. And here is the shoot without lens and shoot without card. This is if you want to just test out some stuff, but personally I don't see why you would want to do either of these, so I would leave these off. For power management here, we could choose how we want this camera to operate. For me, I set this up a little higher to 5 minutes because sometimes I'll go 5 minutes without taking a photo and I want the camera to still be on standby. For performance, I would boost this just to get a little more out of it. And then we set that auto power off temperature to high before. In save data setup, we can choose to select what folder we want to save to or select our copyright info. Neither of these are too important. You can come in here and then add your author's info and then it'll attach that to every photo, but it's not entirely necessary. And then the final menu of this camera is the network and USB settings. And personally, I never use any of these network or USB settings. I know they brag a lot about the Frame.io camera to cloud and some of these other settings, but I am not a fan of connecting these to my smartphone. I just find it's clunky. The easy way to do this for me is to just take the SD card out, move it onto a computer, move it onto a phone, and it's way easier to do it that way. So personally, don't change any of these. I just don't touch any of these. I just focus on all of the other settings. So that was going through the most important settings on the X-T50. Like I said, you can set up the Q menu, you could set up the My menu by yourself. If you want my exact My menu, my exact Q menu, watch the X106 breakdown. I'll link that below, and then you can copy those if you're not sure how you want to set it up. But I mean, it's a great learning opportunity to go through the menu, find out which settings are most important to you, adding them to the menu, finding out that they don't work in the menu, taking them out for something else. So it's good to play around with it. I've been playing around with my camera a lot, and I found that my Q menu and my menu is very good and I like them. So if you want them, go to the other video and feel free to copy them. But now that we've set up this camera, we're gonna hop into how to actually shoot the X-T50. So the first way that I'm going to teach you guys how to use this camera is to set it up as similar to your iPhone as possible. And in order to do that, we're going to go to the front of this camera. We're going to set it into continuous autofocus. For reference, when you move your phone around, that's basically continuous autofocus. It's constantly going to be focusing on what you put in front of the frame. And that's what continuous autofocus is going to do as long as you're half pressing the shutter or holding the AF on button. If you don't hold either of those, the camera doesn't continuously focus because that would drain the battery and make a lot of noise with the lens trying to focus. The next thing that we're gonna do to make it similar to your phone is we're gonna turn it into auto mode. And to do that, we can flip this switch into auto right here, and that's gonna override all of the settings inside of the camera, and it's just gonna shoot in auto. That's good because now you could just focus on getting nice compositions, nice candid photos. You could choose if you want to use your flash or not. So then the only thing that you have to worry about once you're in that auto mode is selecting the correct film simulation. As you can see, it has a really nice selection on the side of the camera here, and I really enjoy how that looks. The other way to shoot auto on this camera is to flip off this auto switch, and then you're just gonna select all of the auto settings on these knobs. So for shutter speed, you're gonna select auto. For the aperture, you're gonna select auto on the lens. And then for the exposure compensation, you'll just set this to 0. If you do want to overexpose, you could go to 1, or underexpose, you could go to -1. But if you put it at 0 and then auto, and then you have your auto ISO set up, which you could choose on the front command dial, then you can have a fully auto X-T50 without ever having to flip that auto switch. Now let's talk about getting into some of the manual modes. If you want to shoot into aperture priority, you're going to leave the shutter speed and the ISO on auto, and then you're going to flip this aperture to this aperture looking icon, and that's going to set this to aperture priority. And now you'll just select your aperture by going through your camera here, and that's going to be very easy. So now if we want to shoot in shutter priority mode, we're going to set this aperture dial back to A. That's going to put the aperture into automatic. And then we're going to go to the shutter speed dial, and all we're going to do is take this off of A, and we're going to select a dedicated shutter speed. If we set this button to T here, then this back command dial is going to select the shutter speed. You can see now we could get very refined shutter speeds here. We can choose from many different kinds. We can go to 30 seconds, I think, if we want to shoot a long exposure, which is simply not something that's available on the top of the camera. You can only get down to 1 second. So if you need to shoot a very long exposure, then set this to T and then select your shutter speed by using this back dial. So next up, we want to shoot in full manual mode, and for that, we're going to switch this to the aperture icon again, and then once again, we'll shoot this with one of the dedicated shutter speeds, or what I like to do is set this to the T. If it's set on the T, then we have aperture on this rein, ISO on this rein, and then we have shutter speed on this rein. I think this is the best way to use the camera. You have 3 dedicated buttons for your exposure triangle, and it's a really good system. Then you could just come over here, select whatever film profile you want, and then you will just focus using the AF on or the shutter style. It's really your personal preference. But for me, I would shoot this camera in manual. Like I said, aperture right here, ISO right here, shutter speed right here, and you are locked in. It's gonna be a fun experience to use this camera. All right, so that is everything you need to know about the X-T50. All of the buttons, all of the important settings inside of the camera, and then most importantly, how to actually shoot and use this camera. But if you're interested in more Fujifilm content, more photography content, make sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, leave a comment, and share with someone who just got this camera. I'll catch you guys in the next one.